Well, Hockey Hall of Famer Ken Dryden passed away on the weekend at the age of 78. Ken Dryden, though, was much more than a hockey player. As his post-playing career showed, he worked in law, he wrote books, he was a broadcaster, a hockey team president, and a politician. And joining us now to talk about his life and legacy is Ottawa writer and author Roy MacGregor, who we are reaching at his cottage this morning on the Gabriel Pizza Hotline. How you doing this morning, Roy?
Good, JR. How are you guys?
We're great. Thank you very much. And if I know you at 8:18 in the morning, you've probably already been out for a canoe ride this morning, right?
Been out with the dog.
Okay. Does the dog go in the canoe?
Oh, yeah.
Okay. All right. And doesn't jump out? Like, is a good canoe accompanist?
No, she prefers the paddle boards.
Okay. Oh, really?
Oh,
Wow.
wow.
Okay. Okay. Good stuff. Well, glad you could join us because you seem like the perfect person to talk about Ken Dryden, who, as we said, was much more than a hockey player. Just when you heard the news, I guess, on the weekend, let's start with that. Just what immediately comes to mind when you think of Ken Dryden?
Well, my initial reaction was shock because, like everyone else, I didn't know about it. Everyone outside the family, Sarah Savard, Scotty Bowman, people like me, that we didn't know. It wasn't until Friday morning I got a quick email from Ken's wife, Linda, to inform me and others that this had happened and to keep it quiet for a while. They make an announcement later in the day, which they did. So the first thing that came to mind, of course, was just utter shock, just stunned.
You collaborated with Ken years ago for Home Game, kind of Ken's sequel to the game. Take us back. You spent a lot of time with him back then, obviously. You knew who Ken Dryden was before then, obviously, as well. How did that come together, Roy, in that relationship, and you collaborated on the book?
Well, when I was very young, I guess about 25 or so, I got a job at Maclean's magazine. I was kind of a junior person there, but they knew that I liked hockey and fooled around at hockey and that. They had been approached by this guy, Ken Dryden, who had played in the Summit Series in 1972, and he wanted to write about it. And so at a meeting with the editors at Maclean's, that's when Peter Newman was running the magazine, it was said that, he'll have to have a ghostwriter because he's a jock, and of course they can't write or even read. And so they assigned me to work with him. So Ken and I got together. He came down, he even stayed with us. And we worked together. He had all these notebooks. They were red plastic covers, and there seems like a dozen of them or more of his thoughts written in longhand as the series was going on. So we picked through that, and we come up with a thing, and I sat down to write what was going to be his story. And I wrote it, and I got it to him, and he looked at it, and it was a piece of crap, let me tell you. It was an embarrassment. And he very politely, because he's a very polite man, said, Roy, would you mind if I had a little run at this? And I said, yeah, but what can you do? And so he did, and it was fantastic. It was just a beautifully written piece. I remember one small section in it, which had nothing to do really with the series, but really told everything. And he wrote about how later on in the series, there was a face-off to his left, and he was getting ready and looking up and making sure who was on the ice and that. And he looked at Boris Mikhailov, the captain of the Soviet Union team, and Mikhailov winked at him. And it was as if to say, we are involved in something so special, we probably don't even realize it yet. And that turned out to be absolutely true. The magnitude of that series, more than 50 years later, just resonates, and it really was the most important thing I think that ever happened to the game.
How thoughtful was he when you just kind of, other than you reading sort of what he wrote, but just when you would have discussions with him specifically, maybe about hockey, like how thoughtful a guy was he?
Well, he's the only person that I have known in my life whose brain seemed to work outside of his skull. You could sit there and have a conversation with him, and yeah, I know he could be long-winded, and he knew he could be long-winded, so that's just an amusement, not a knock. And you would sense his brain working, and you would see him get excited, and he'd think, well, here's a train of thought I hadn't thought of before, but I'm going to chase it down and see where it goes and what comes of it. And it would be absolutely enthralling because you'd be sitting there listen, I don't want to say genius or anything. That's a bad word to throw out. But in a way, he was, and he just had a way of thinking and thinking things through and analyzing that I had never seen before. And I think that it bode well when he became a politician, when he ran the Toronto Maple Leafs, and of course when he wrote all those best-selling books.
He never let one part of his life define him, Roy, right? Like, it's world-class, one of the best goaltenders in the history of the game, Summit Series, all of that, individual accolades, Stanley Cups. All right, lawyer, I can run an NHL team as well. I can write books. I had a pleasure of meeting him multiple times and had the pleasure of interviewing a few times in this studio. He never came across as somebody that should be revered, right? He was so humble in so many ways.
So kind to every single person. If he happened to be in a place where people wanted to meet him or they were standing gawking at him, he would make sure that he shook every hand, signed every piece of paper or whatever. But, you think about a lot of athletes, and I really don't mean to knock them here. I can't blame them at all. They milk their career. They milk their athletic career for the rest of their lives in various ways, whether it's sponsorships or whatever. And he never did anything like that. He just kept moving on to the next challenge. And he set hockey aside and went into politics. He set politics aside and went into authorship. And he was always progressing. And I think possibly that's got to do with the shock so many of us feel like he was. I talked to him several times this year, mostly by emails and that, but I had no indication there was anything wrong with him. He never said a word about it.
With the Ottawa author and writer Roy MacGregor on the passing of Ken Dryden, who died on the weekend at the age of 78. Roy, I don't want to date you, but you're old enough to remember Ken Dryden as a player coming into the NHL as a raw rookie, six minor league games under his belt, and the powerful Montreal Canadiens are going to the Stanley Cup final in that year. What do you remember of that and the story of Ken Dryden, especially in that rookie season?
Well, they weren't expected to do anything in the playoffs, as I recall. They just did not have a rock-solid team, and he came up with that 6 games left, and he had come from, well, they came up from the Voyageurs, of course, but prior to that, he'd been at Cornell, where he had a record, it was something like 74 or 94, just an insane record. And so people didn't know much about him, except that he was big and unusually big, and goaltenders used to be, I'm old enough, and I think you guys are too, to remember when the goalie was always the smallest guy in the team. It just kind of fell to him or her. And so you get the Darren Pangs and people like that, and then suddenly this guy comes along who's 6'4", towers over the net, has this bizarre habit of standing there like he's waiting in line for the washroom or something. Just put hands up and just patiently waiting for stuff to develop. And yet he was amazing. And when they played, and they were up against the great Boston teams, Bobby Orr and that, and he took them to the Stanley Cup. And then it only happened once, as far as I know. The next year he wins the Rookie of the Year. It was almost backwards, right?
Mm-hmm. And then not too long after that, got into a bit of a contract dispute. Said, "I'm good. I'll go to law school. I'll take the year off, and you can come back to me." And they came back to him, and then he resumed his career and. More Vezina trophies, more Stanley Cups. Oh, and I'm going to shut it down when I'm still in my prime.
Yeah, but we're talking to the Ottawa audience. I imagine a lot of people know, but maybe not everybody knows that Ken came to Ottawa that year, and he studied, and at the same time he played in the beer league with the group of guys, and often we played against them, or our beer league group, and
wow.
He was a defenseman. He wouldn't play net.
So what do you remember about that? Playing against Ken Dryden.
Oh, God, you could go around him like he was a fence post.
Okay. Fantastic.
The other little nugget, Roy, that I learned over the weekend, because just trying to, consume so much Ken Dryden stories. So he does color in Lake Placid, with Al Michaels. And before, the game, right, he had to go drive up to Ottawa and write the bar exam and then come back to Lake Placid in time for the game. Al Michaels has told that story. That's a great story as well.
I didn't know that.
Yeah.
That's amazing. Well, he went when he played for the Voyageurs. He refused. He had a deal where he only played in Quebec City or Montreal, so that he could continue his studies at McGill. he had his priorities. You know, he was stuff. Let me tell you a story. We were working on the CBC series home game, and it was long, and it was directed by Peter Pearson, and it was quite a successful series, but documentary. And at one point, I had one idea, and Ken had another idea, and I went and complained to Peter Pearson, the director. I said, "Jesus Christ, this guy's stubborn and hard to deal with." I know. I was kind of peeved. And Peter looked at me and says, "Roy, you don't understand. He's a goaltender. His natural inclination is to block everything that comes his way."
Oh,
that's good.
There have been many great books written about the game of hockey. You may have authored one or two of those. You know, what do you consider in retrospect or upon reflection the game, his book, to be? We can talk about the history of the game.
If I can go back a bit to talking about those binders that I mentioned earlier on. After the piece came out in Maclean's, I went and spoke to Douglas Gibson, who was the publisher of McClellan and Stewart, and they were publishing a book that I was writing at the time, which was a novel about hockey called The Last Season. And I started to talk to Doug about he's really got to chat to Ken and really get him going on it. There's a book in this guy, and he's really special. And so eventually it took years and years for him to do it because Ken does not move quickly on things like that. And so in 1983, the game came out, which is, everyone says, the best book ever written about hockey, and I certainly would never dispute that. It's brilliant. And my book, The Last Season, came out, and McClellan and Stewart had this brilliant idea that they'd put out these bookmarks in all the stores in Canada, and they did the bookmarks for free to be taken at the cash. And on one side was the Ken Dryden's The Game, and the other side was Roy MacGregor's The Last Season. And I can tell you both, I assure you, I checked every store in the country, and never once did I find my side up.
So many years ago, going back to the blockbuster movies, that was Barbieheimer years ago when Barbie and Oppenheimer came out together, and they marketed together. But your bookmark was never the right side up. Okay, all right. Home game though that you did with Ken Dryden, Roy, and I think I've told you this before. Love that book. Still love that book. I convinced my English teacher, we had to do a book report in high school, and this book wasn't on the list. And I convinced them they let me, all right, the only way this kid's going to pay attention, he likes sports, let him do it here.
You're right on.
It was good. There's a passage towards the end of the chat. It compares baseball to hockey. And
yes.
I've got it in front. I'm not going to read the whole thing, but the whole point is baseball is what we wish life was like. There's no clock. It just skill matters, but you know what? It's magical because it doesn't run out. Hockey is real life, right? It's finite here. In your conversations with Ken and putting together the tone of the book, how did that all come together?
Oh, we would just sit around and gab about what hockey meant and that, and I had nothing to do with that beautiful, beautiful sequence that he wrote. It just came out of him one day. That was the kind of thing that would roll out of his mouth when you were sitting there talking to him, and you interviewed him, Jer, and probably Steve does too. When you talk to him, you kind of always wished you were writing down what he was saying.
Yeah.
But sometimes you were being too polite and just listening, but you're thinking inside, you're going, holy smokes, I never thought about that.
He went on to a great many things, including time as the team president of the Maple Leafs. We remember it well here in Ottawa because that was the years that the Leafs were beating the Sens in the playoffs. And then I don't know. Maybe you can speak to it more. Take us back through the decision, what you know of him to leave that, and then actually enter a career in politics of all things.
Yeah, I don't really have any particular insight, but I can assure you that playing or managing hockey in Toronto is not fun if it's not going really well. They weren't winning Stanley Cups, obviously, because no Canadian team did since 1993. And Ken wore a lot of that. The media was not particularly kind to him when he was in charge of the Leafs because they're always looking for a scapegoat, aren't they? And so I think he just got tired of it, frankly, and there was an opening coming up that he could run for the Liberals. Paul Martin was the new leader. Ken ran. He won easily. and they made him a cabinet minister, and he brought in what eventually became the child care situation in Canada, which is pretty good. It's not perfect, but it's pretty good, and it really owes its origins to Ken's work in the early part of this century.
Can you compare Ken Dryden's, career, and I'm not talking just hockey career, to anybody else where the genesis was sports, right? It started with hockey. And it's a roundabout way of me asking, will we ever see anybody quite like this in professional sports? To be at that peak of stardom in your said sport, but really you did so much more.
No, we never will, because, I don't know, when God gave out the genes to the Dryden family, he forgot to add in vanity. And, both Dave, a lovely, lovely, lovely person, and Ken and their sister, they're all just very humble people who measure everyone equally and take nothing for granted, and are hardworking, humble, the old Canadian cliche. And he lived it, he was it, and he will stand as it forever, I think.
Well, we think you're the perfect guy to talk about the life and legacy of Ken Dryden, so we really appreciate you taking just a few minutes of your time today out with the dog or in the canoe to share some memories of Ken Dryden.
Okay, thanks, guys. I appreciate it very much.